The logical fallacy known as ad populum is generally defined as the appeal to the majority. In other words, if all or most people believe in something, then it must be true. And at one time, people thought the sun revolved around the earth and that the earth was flat. Because these were ideas accepted by the majority, they were not opposed for hundreds of years. Modern day examples can be found in many advertisements. Whenever a company claims that more people choose their brand over another, they're implying that because more people like them, that makes them the better brand.
The logical fallacy known as the post hoc fallacy is also called the fallacy of false cause. This fallacy is derived from the Latin phrase post hoc ergo propter hoc, which translates as after this, therefore because of this. This fallacy says that if one action comes after another, the first event caused the second one. In society, the most known example of this fallacy was malaria. In 1956, Stuart Chase, the author of Guides to Straight Thinking, found that malaria, a baffling plague that killed for centuries, was associated with this fallacy. Night air was assumed to be the cause of malaria. According to him, people got malaria because they went out at night, so people no longer went out after dark. It was only after many experiences that people learned that the disease was caused by mosquitoes, which back then preferred to attack in the dark. Now, this short clip will show one of my favorite Christmas characters, Frosty the Snowman, also employing the post hoc fallacy.
Uh-oh.
What's the matter, Frosty?
Whew. Is there a thermometer around here?
Over there in the wall. Why?
Oh, I was afraid of that. The thermometer's getting red. I hate red thermometers.
Why, Frosty?
Because when the thermometer gets all reddish, the temperature goes up.
Weber and Burries define the term red herring as a diversionary tactic that avoids the key issues, often by avoiding opposing arguments, rather than addressing them. This logical fallacy is often used in politics when a question is difficult to answer and the politician wishes to avoid it altogether. They try to win the argument by avoiding the initial topic of the argument. Let's watch this video depicting an interview between Michelle Bachmann and Anderson Cooper during the last presidential election.
Republican Paul Ryan has suggested sharp cuts in Medicare and Social Security. Are you willing to make cuts there?
Well, I think we know that just within a day or so, the President of the United States will be taking a trip over to India that is expected to cost the taxpayers $200 million a day. He's taking 2,000 people with him. He'll be renting out over 870 rooms in India, and these are five-star hotel rooms at the Taj Mahal Palace Hotel. This is the
red herring here is rather obvious, to say the least. The question was basically, are you willing to make cuts to Medicare and Social Security? The answer, or in this case the red herring, was Bachmann stating that the president was taking an expensive and lengthy trip to India. She said a lot of big numbers to emphasize over-the-top spending, but she didn't even mention Medicare or Social Security, which was the main point of Cooper's question. This is then a classic example of the logical fallacy known as the red herring.
An ad hominem fallacy is one in which, during an argument, an individual decides to attack his or her opponent on a personal level instead of addressing the opponent's actual argument. During this attack, opponent A will say things about the belief and character of opponent B as a means of ignoring, discrediting, or blunting the force of their argument. For example, this clip shows an interview with ABC News that Barack Obama did during his last presidential campaign. In this interview, he is using an ad hominem fallacy when he is asked about Sarah Palin.
Sarah Palin, taking aim at your decision to restrict use of nuclear weapons, your pledge not to strike nations, non-nuclear nations, who abide by the non-proliferation treaty. Here's what she said. She said, it's unbelievable. No other administration would do it. And then she likened it to kids on a playground. She said, you're like a kid who says, punch me in the face, and I'm not going to retaliate.
Yeah. In this upcoming scene, you will be watching one of my favorite commercials. This commercial strongly uses a slippery slope fallacy to try and urge the viewer to buy its product, because if you don't, you could end up in a roadside ditch after a series of mysteriously linked events.
When your cable company keeps you on hold, you get angry. When you get angry, you go blow off steam. When you go blow off steam, accidents happen. When accidents happen, you get an eye patch. When you get an eye patch, people think you're tough. When people think you're tough, people want to see how tough. And when people want to see how tough, you wake up in a roadside ditch. Don't wake up in a roadside ditch.
The use of the slippery slope fallacy here is pretty obvious. The commercial is saying that if you don't buy DirecTV, then you will do something that will cause something to happen, which would in the end finish with an extremely exaggerated situation. So you should buy DirecTV. Up next is my roommate Jacob and I giving an example of the straw man fallacy. This fallacy is based on a misrepresentation of your opponent's position. So one could simply turn something into a big deal when it's nothing important at all. Hey Jacob, do you support video game violence?
Well, since it's not real, then yes.
Well, since you support video game violence, then you must think it's okay when these kids go out and shoot kids in real life, huh?
Whatever.
Are you kidding me? I just bought this car and it already has a flat tire? This is such a terrible decision. What you just saw was a hasty overgeneralization. I jumped to an extreme conclusion without having enough evidence to support the claim. I claimed that the car was a bad buy simply because it got a flat tire early on, when in reality the flat tire had nothing to do with the actual car.
Ryan Burge is a good shooter because he has good shooting form. This is an example of a circular argument. It restates the argument rather than actually proving it. In my example, I'm trying to prove that I'm a good shooter because I have good shooting form, when in reality, it shows that just because I have good shooting form doesn't make me a good shooter. You would need actual evidence to prove it, such as statistics or something, not just shooting form.
I just have a really important job interview coming up.
That's okay. It's not that big of a deal if you
No,
don't get it.
It is. It is a really big deal. Either I get this job or I'm going to be a hobo for the rest of my life. This is an example of the either-or logical fallacy. I reduced the argument to two sides. Either this happens or that happens. There's no middle ground. Just because I don't get a job doesn't mean I'm going to end up a hobo, but that's the two options that I reduced the argument to.
Man, how'd I get an F? I should have had a much higher grade. That teacher must hate me. Man, that teacher who gave me a failing grade is the most unfair teacher in the world. This is an example of moral equivalence. It compares minor misdeeds with major atrocities. I'm comparing the teacher who gave me a failing grade with the most unfair teacher in the world, when in fact, an unbiased machine graded my test, not the teacher. So the teacher wasn't being unfair at all.